Question: do you want this camera or this camera?
No, I think the other one.
Other one?
Can I get that password?
Yeah. 909-647.
Chris sends you his regards. He's traveling to the Munich security
Oh, good.
conference.
That's a good reason to miss me. Yeah, we just get his, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you're there. His book.
You have a copy already?
Chipboard?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I don't. I brought one just in case. We have some Fletcher swag for you as well.
No, yeah, I'm recommending his book to any.
It's quite real.
Yeah. I'm curious for him for figuring out like a couple years ago what the.
So it's always considered. You know what? I think even with the sound, let's go ahead and stop here. That way we can leave some space for students. I think it's completely fine.
Yeah.
The sound.
Well, at least make sure you're facing it, because we can definitely do it.
Okay. Well, what if we're just kind of sideways like this? Is that okay? Yeah, I think
As long as you're really projecting, I think you'll be all right. Test the units. Let's make sure.
so good.
Those actually.
That's just decorative.
Facing that way, from 10 to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Great.
And Zoom kicked me off, so I need to log it in.
I didn't kick you off.
I had to like enable.
Yeah. Use some user for typing.
And that's actually.
Yes, we have at least one staff member.
Okay, great.
We have one PhD in the room. I think everybody else.
You don't see what's good.
We'll have a few more for that, and so we'll start it on.
Okay, maybe I can figure out.
Perfect.
All right.
Amazing. Excellent.
Talking to George a couple weeks ago. So,
Oh,
gotta roll with it.
how long have you been at Georgetown?
So I just got here. I teach like once, probably every other year there. That's since
Let us know if you need any help.
that's about all I have time for kind of in my day job. Probably like here, that's kind of a common setup. You know, DC people do that for time.
Yeah, most of our adjunct faculty have affiliations in Boston. Some of them you see, they usually come for a fellowship for a year or something.
Yeah, I feel like that just policy minded schools tend to have that be just a more common.
Right.
Solely I.
This is.
That's why I like speaking. For being there.
What were you doing early in your career at US Embassy Kiev?
That was kind of my first job and first time in the region. I was in the political section here, 2007. So very different time, but that was my first foray into this region. And the rest is history.
What time was that?
2007. Yeah.
Early after work revolution.
Yeah.
What's the ambassador?
Bill Taylor,
All right.
his first time. His first tenure.
We've had him at Fletcher before.
Yeah. So he's great. It's good for him to go back and man the embassy in that very strange time.
I have a friend who was a Fletcher alum and was at the US Embassy in Kiev. In the consulate section, but he was there right up until the war started.
Wow. Yes. Which one do you want?
Go ahead and get started. All right, everyone. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting discussion. We're pleased today to host Claire Kaiser. She is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian and Eastern European Studies and head of strategy for McLarty Associates, a global strategy firm based in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Georgian and Soviet, entitled Nationhood and the Specter of Stalin in the Caucasus, which just came out recently. So we're excited to hear more about the book. I'm Arik Berkovsky. I manage the Russia and Eurasia Program at Fletcher, and we're organizing this event today. A little bit more about our distinguished guest. She has been an instructor at the Department of State's Foreign Service Institute. She served as an election observer for the OSCE in Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And she also served at the US Embassy in Kiev. So we're very pleased to have you today. And she'll speak for about 30-40 minutes about the book, and we'll have a Q&A session. So please.
Great. Thanks, Arik, and thanks everyone for coming today. This is one of my very first events to sort of debut the book now that it's out into the world. So thank you / apologies for being kind of the guinea pigs here and hearing this talk, but I'm really grateful for your interest and for the chance to be here today. So as Arik said, I'll plan to talk for 30 or 40 minutes or so, and then I'm very interested to hear your questions, your feedback, because I think this is a topic that, while I certainly argue that is important, is one that hasn't really been discussed a whole lot to date, certainly among historians, but also among more of the policy-minded crowd, which I suspect many of you are kind of bridging that divide as I am. So I have some slides here, but they're not too text heavy. So as I said, guinea pigs. All right, so wanted to start our discussion taking us back to March of 1956, and an episode that probably all but two of you have known about. In March of 1956, tens of thousands of Georgians took to the streets in Tbilisi and really across the Republic to protest what they regarded as a denigration of Stalin as a national hero by Khrushchev in a secret speech. This is the famous 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, where Khrushchev, in front of the entire kind of Soviet communist bureaucracy, blamed Stalin for all of the crimes of the 30s and 40s, basically pinned all responsibility for the terror and the purges on Stalin, as well as revealed the extent of some of the ethnically based deportations, like the Chechens, et cetera. But kind of put that blame really in Stalin as a person in many ways, to save Khrushchev and others who were very much, I think, the ones who operationalized those policies in their respective locales in that period. But in any case, this was in theory, secret speech. Needless to say, word got out pretty quickly, rumors spread very, very quickly. And so as Georgian delegates to that meeting in Moscow started to trickle back to Georgia, the key takeaway that they had that really spread like wildfire among the population was that Khrushchev had said some derogatory things about Stalin, but especially kind of denigrating Stalin as a Georgian. And so they did not take lightly to this perceived kind of national offense. And he did say some things that I think pretty clearly could be construed that way in the secret speech. So this was in mid-February or so of 1956. The anniversary of Stalin's death, he had died 3 years prior, was just around the corner on March 5th. And so as they had done for the past 3 years, Georgians, and not just Georgians, I mean, people all over the Soviet Union were starting to kind of, bring flowers and memorial wreaths and that sort of thing to Stalin monuments and commemorate the anniversary of his death, as had become custom, given the extremely robust cult of personality that had been constructed around him. They weren't supposed to do that, but of course, people didn't get the memo because policy change was still secret at that point. This swelled very, very quickly into policing from, a defiant, commemoration of Stalin's death to one that, as I said, really shut down the city completely in the course of a couple of days, and ultimately then resulted in Soviet troops cracking down and killing a few dozen people, most of them, students, young people, a mix of young women and men. And so this is, again, within weeks of Khrushchev saying that he's not going to use the same violent repressive tactics that just blame Stalin for, and yet he's doing it, literally in Stalin's backyard here, for a demonstration that was somewhat contrarily, in defense of Stalin as a national figure against this broader policy change of de-Stalinization, though that's not what Khrushchev called it at the time. So there's a lot to unravel there, but needless to say, this was an extremely important event for Soviet Georgia, which is the subject of my book. And really, for me, was kind of the entry point into wanting to understand more, what the impact of Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union, one of the most powerful figures in the world, from World War II onward, what the impact of his rise, his network, his cult of personality really had on his homeland, because this was a place that he had a very, I would say, conflicted and contradictory relationship with, both publicly and privately. And I think, there have been any number of books written on Stalin's psychology and, the extent to which his childhood affected his policy decisions, that sort of thing. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm not going to write yet another 1,000-page Stalin biography. But what I'm much more interested in how that was received among the population in Georgia, and not just Georgians, and then this sort of subsequent generational impact that it's had over the rest of the 20th century and even up to today. So in this picture, and I think this actually kind of speaks to this interesting tension that these March 1956 events have had subsequently. This is a pretty easy plaque to miss just off of Rustaveli Avenue, which is the main sort of 19th century thoroughfare in downtown Tbilisi. And so you see in the Georgian and the English, some sort of, artificial bullet holes there that says, this monument commemorates the participants of a peaceful rally gunned down by the Soviet regime on March 9, 1956. So factually true, but also skipping what I would argue are some pretty important details there. Why the people were in the streets to begin with. There still remains, a lot of speculation about who actually gave the order to crack down. But in any case, this memorial was put up when Saakashvili was president, and so kind of speaks to how this event is commemorated in interesting, if not entirely transparent ways, in more recent years. So for me, this was a really important entry point into this broader project because I think it's an event that clearly had important implications within Georgia, but it's something that had very little, people outside of Georgia had no idea about it for obvious reasons. And there's no way that Moscow or anybody else wanted others to be aware that this happened, and we know about the uprising in Poland, we know about the uprising, brutal crackdown later in 1956 in Hungary, but like this is not really on the map of 1956, which is an incredibly important year in Soviet and Eastern European history. And so, I think that first and foremost is important. But secondly, it opened up a real change in the relationship between Moscow and Tbilisi that would have extremely important implications for how Soviet Georgia fit into the broader kind of ethno-territorial configuration of the USSR, really until 1989. And so I pin a lot on this moment. It happens at the middle of my book, and was kind of how I got into this project more generally. And so the key questions that really drove me to this book, first of all, we're looking at the possibility or ability to be Georgian and Soviet, not Georgian or Soviet. I think in recent years, there's been sort of, and this is something that I think has been derived from more current politics, that it was not possible to kind of simultaneously be Georgian, celebrate Georgian national identity, and also use Soviet institutions to sort of pursue those aims. It was one or the other, but a kind of perception that all along Georgians were, dissidents in disguise and never really wanted to go along with the Soviet project. Of course, that's an oversimplification, but the "and" in my title is actually doing a lot of work there in terms of argument. And so I wanted to explore the kind of institutional capacity for Soviet nation building and what Georgians ended up doing with that within the context of Soviet empire. And secondly, I want to look at the Stalin nexus, and this isn't limited to Stalin the man. Stalin had an extremely deep and entrenched network that included a lot of Georgians as well as other people from the Caucasus, and not only, I'm thinking of like Anastas Mikoyan or Lavrentiy Beria or others. That included people like Sergei Kirov, who kind of grew up and developed his career in the Caucasus. So there was a certain Caucasus group that came up with Stalin and through Stalin's network. That of course had implications not just on the local politics and population of the Caucasus and Georgia specifically, but on the broader history of the Soviet Union. And so, these kind of deeply kind of personal debates and decisions that this group ends up making have consequences, much, much larger that I think we're still dealing with in some cases. And so just trying to untangle what those impacts were on Georgia proper, what was something else that I sought to do with this book. And then finally, and I think this might be one of the more relevant points now, a year into the full-scale invasion by Russia into Ukraine, is really shifting the vantage point from Moscow-centric perspectives on Soviet history. I suspected and then I think confirmed by doing the vast majority of my research in Georgian archives based in Tbilisi for this book, that the story does change when you really listen more to the Georgian voices as opposed to just sort of taking that for granted and assuming that what you get in Moscow is going to be, the full picture and the right picture. You're not going to get that if you're just looking at Russian. You're not going to get that if you just look at central sources. And you're not going to get that if you just confine yourself to archives also to get at some of the challenges of historians based on sources. And so, I firmly believe that to kind of understand how the Soviet Union functioned as an empire and how it managed, ethno-national diversity, you have to give, privilege to the non-Russian voices and non-Russian, sources and actors here. Don't assume that they're just sort of objects of empire. They can be agents of it in some cases, but in other ways, they found ways to sort of use the Soviet institutional framework to pursue their own agendas. And that's a really key kind of part of my book and something that, a story that would not have come through had I tried to do this from, Moscow-based or Russian-based sources. And something that I think we absolutely have to do, going forward now. So in terms of the primary interventions that I'm making here, number one, really focusing on the post-war and post-Stalin era. That's something that I think when I started this project a decade ago, this generation of historians was just starting to get to like the post-war period of Soviet history. A lot of people have put out great books in recent years, really on the Khrushchev era, the Brezhnev era, et cetera. And now people are actually starting to look at the 90s in historical perspective, which is sort of interesting. But the post-war period for Georgia and for the Caucasus generally, is something that people have not written about in depth yet from a historical perspective. So that's kind of one intervention for me. And more broadly, when I was in grad school, et cetera, the historiography and the literature was so focused on the 30s and kind of the era of Korenizatsiya and high Stalinism. And then it just basically, you do World War II and then you jump to Gorbachev. Obviously, there's some pretty important decades in between, but there hadn't been historically grounded studies that had really done the kind of archival work and time in the field to sort of figure out, what at a granular level, those nuances really were. And so for Soviet Georgia, that was something that I really wanted to probe in depth. Number two, the Stalin nexus, as I mentioned before, again, not looking at Stalin through biography necessarily, but Stalin, as kind of the man bigger than himself and the cult and various unintended consequences that the construction of the Stalin cult, entailed. Third, really looking at the Soviet Union as an empire, not in the sense of its empire in Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact countries, which I think people, fully understand, what that sort of imperial relationship meant. But, honestly, to date, there's kind of been a debate, both among scholars and practitioners about the extent to which the Soviet Union was an empire, because it didn't exactly look like, the traditional overseas empires of the French or the Dutch or the Brits or whatever. I think there's been a more productive discussion comparing the Soviet Empire to maybe the Ottomans or the Austro-Hungarians, et cetera. But anyway, I think that the debate has shifted again with the war in Ukraine in ways that I think for scholarship will end up generating some very interesting new lines of inquiry. But I think that the Georgian example really shows, on the one hand, how and why the Soviet Union absolutely did function as an empire, but also how it could change over time in terms of how it can manage ethno-national diversity and create, new types of hierarchies for the non-Russian populations within it. And so that's kind of one of the key methodological interventions that I make here that I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then finally, sources. And I referred to this a bit earlier. I did the vast majority of research for this in Tbilisi through Georgian archives and Georgian-based sources in a combination of Georgian and Russian, because that's what the materials were in. And so again, I think there are some others. Frankly, the people working on Georgian history are in the kind of Anglophone academy. It's a small number of us, and the handful of us who are working on it, are using Georgian sources, but still. The fact that that's like a novel thing, I feel bad saying like, oh, it's great that I use Georgian because it should be so obvious, but that's still important, I think, to come across because it's not something that people automatically assume, which is weird, but it is what it is.
It's not a common language to study.
Yeah, and it's especially hard to study in the US. There's like very little institutional ability to just like take it for a couple semesters, on campus and that sort of thing.
You cannot study it in a couple semesters either.
No. So I had to do, stints of like very intense one-on-one, Georgia tutoring in Tbilisi mixed with like Skype when I couldn't get to Georgia to get it done. But yeah. So those are the primary interventions of the book. And then some of this might be familiar to some of you, but just to get everybody on that same page. So the Georgian SSR at a glance. Invaded by the Bolshevik army in February of 1921, I think, and we're like very close to the date, I think it's next week, when that actually occurred. And
almost matches the invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly.
By one day.
Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to note that there was, an independent Democratic Republic of Georgia from 1918 to 1921 that really accomplished an amazing amount in 3 years, but geopolitically was really, up against all odds. And so, the Bolshevik Red Army had to, forcibly invade and conquer this independent country in order to take power. There was very little Bolshevik support locally, in spite of the famous Bolsheviks that we know now who came from Georgia. This was a popularly elected democratic, government that had to flee the Bolshevik advance in February 1921. So the Georgian SSR that ended up being, territorially constructed had 3 autonomous areas, which will be familiar to you because they continue to have, important places in geopolitics now. Those are Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Adjara. And I'll talk a little bit more about what these types of autonomy mean a bit later. Ethnic Georgians comprised, about 2/3 or so the percent of the population of Georgia, which again is pretty high, but it's not as high, for example, as neighboring Armenia, for example, which had a much more homogeneous population by nationality, according to Soviet census. So significant minorities, including not just Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Greeks, Kurds, Russians, of course, Jews, and so that made Soviet Georgia a fairly ethnically diverse polity, but also one that it looked very different depending on where you were sitting. Tbilisi versus some of the border regions versus Abkhazia. In some places Georgians had the majority outright, in other cases they did not, and that affected very much the kind of perceptions of power and local politics and that sort of thing. On the flip side of that, the vast majority of ethnic Georgians in the Soviet Union lived in Georgia, and so you had a small diaspora. One, of course, it was extremely influential in the Stalin era, but 95% or more ethnic Georgians lived in Georgia, which is very different from a lot of the other republics. Population-wise, one of the smallest Soviet republics, though there are a number kind of in that 2-ish% of the population at various points in the Soviet period. One big differentiator for the Georgian SSR was that they had ethnic Georgian leadership for the entire 70-year period of Soviet Georgia. And that's highly unusual. In most cases, if you look at Central Asia, very often you would have ethnic Russians or Ukrainians, as serving as the Communist Party first secretary or Council of Ministers chairman. And that was certainly the case in places like Ukraine or elsewhere. And so Georgia was very unusual in that, on paper, ethnic Georgians were running the show. And in the Stalin period, they were also running the show in Moscow too. So that is I think an important differentiator for Georgia vis-a-vis the rest of the Soviet Union. Perhaps related to that, there were disproportionately high levels of Georgian party membership, higher education levels, and that sort of thing. And so they were meeting and exceeding kind of what the Soviet institutional structures of nationality were designed to do, and doing that from a pretty early period. Again, somewhat related to that, you saw a fairly low penetration of Russian as a second language, or at least as a professed fluent second language among ethnic Georgians in Georgia. And that's something that was the case even in the 70s, kind of during the Brezhnev era, efforts to really improve Russian proficiency union-wide. I think some of that might just be that in a census context, Georgians might not want to admit that they're just as comfortable in Russian as they are Georgian, but certainly in daily life and practice, the Georgian language in Georgia was very dominant, and reflected, I think, the sort of local power contours as well. Just some key Georgian figures for those of you who might not follow Georgia as closely as others. Stalin, of course, born in Gori in the late 19th century, Yosef Dugashvili by birth, Lavrent Beria, his key deputy, who ended up, after running Georgia for the better part of the 30s, ran the NKVD in Moscow prior to and during World War II, and then ran the Soviet nuclear program. So again, from Western Georgia, in a Georgian pocket part of Abkhazia, but again, someone who had an enormous influence on Soviet history in his own right. Sergei Ordzhonikidze, who is kind of an old Bolshevik, who again, in the Stalin era, ended up being the commissar of heavy industry. So again, like really having a huge union-wide significance, but continuing to have influence in Georgia and the Caucasus. And then finally, Edward Shevardnadze, a name that I'm sure will ring a bell to all of you. But before he was foreign minister of the Soviet Union, before he was president of independent Georgia, prime minister of Georgia, he ran Soviet Georgia in the 70s and early 80s, and actually, was a fascinating figure to kind of follow early in his career, and seeing, the types of, experiments, reforms, but also compromises he was having to make, within that new role locally that I think people outside of Georgia just aren't really aware of. But I find that to be extremely fascinating. So a quick primer on nation building Soviet style. And this, again, is kind of the broader literature that this book is speaking to. As I think probably most of you are familiar, the Soviet Union had an explicit policy toward nationality, and this was rooted in, Marxist-Leninist conceptions of, the march of history and the role that the nationalist stage of historical consciousness had vis-a-vis, the march from feudalism to capitalism to communism. So, it was viewed that national consciousness and then the sort of nationalist stage aligned with capitalism. And so in order to make the, glorious march to communism someday, you had to go through that capitalist / nationalist phase. Lenin, kind of wanted to leapfrog the capitalist phase, and that was kind of his, key intervention there. But as Lenin and Stalin as Commissar of Nationalities in the 20s, as they sort of conceived of the Soviet ethno-territorial schema, they believed that if they endowed specific nationalities with rights to access to language, to particular schools, to defining territory and borders along ethnic lines, to promoting local nomenclatura and cadre, party membership, et cetera. Again, trying to make things look more national, and then having the map of the Soviet Union be drawn on national lines, both at the republic level, but also at the sub-republic level with various autonomous regions. The idea with expending all of those resources into cultivating national distinction was such that they could, then, speed along that developmental trajectory to overcome those national distinctions. Of course, in retrospect, that's not at all what happened, but that was the theory behind the Soviet ethno-territorial map, and why you had not only the borders drawn the way they were, but things like language, as well as autonomous regions having the significance that they did. I think Yuri Sloskin, who kind of wrote one of the key early conceptual academic texts on this for the American Academy, he referred to the Soviet Union as a communal apartment, but there's maybe some issues with that concept. But I think for me, the more interesting takeaway from that article was the idea of the Soviet Union in the era of Korenizatsiya and in the 20s as one of ethnophilia. You have like infinite number of ethnic groups. It isn't just ones that would be have the republic level status, like Georgia, like Armenia, like Ukraine, but going down to what might be regarded as sub national groups, small peoples of the north, et cetera. Groups that really were extremely small in number. So really pursuing a lot of resource allocation to at a very deep level in the 20s and early 30s for that, and then in the Stalin era, basically doubling down on a smaller number of what they regarded as more developed nationalities that ended up, of course, being at the republic level for the most part. So I think the resources expended to develop those nationalities were just as extensive as they were in the era of ethnophilia. But again, it's focused on making those republic level nationalities in particular have greater dominance in their own republic. And so, that is an element that, I try to show how that worked in practice among Georgians, and not just stop, at 1938 or 1945, basically, but see what sort of institutional architecture then that created for second and third generation Soviet Georgians to, use those institutions and that template to kind of, run with and adapt to their own needs in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There were, of course, much darker sides to Soviet nation building, not to say that, things like constructing synthesis categories, that, of course, involves a certain amount of assimilation and erasure as well in their own right. Defining languages, the same thing, territory and borders, extremely contested in the Caucasus, and that's something that the border drawers of this time were acutely aware of. But things like deportations, expulsions, internal forced resettlements, et cetera, this is all part of the Soviet nation building toolkit that was put into practice, I think, in the 20s through 40s, but it didn't end there, and so that's kind of the story that my book picks up, and really, the thing that the way that I approach this nation building Soviet style element is seeing how Georgians at the local level, took these various tools, again, which were in theory available to majority nationalities and other republics as well, and how they adapted them to kind of meet their national interests. So pursuing national agendas that sometimes went along with the broader Soviet, goals, but in other cases, maybe weren't exactly what Moscow may have intended or wanted. And so, seeing that little bit of agency and tension there. And so this brings me to, again, one of the sort of methodological interventions I'm trying to make with this book, and that's this concept of entitled nationhood. I don't mean to use entitled in a pejorative sense. I'm not talking about, like, oh, this entitled kid who thinks he's owed everything. Like, that's not how I mean this. I am basically, I was always very uncomfortable with the term titular to describe, Ukrainians in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenians, Armenia, et cetera. And that tended to be how, at least in, I think, whether it was Soviet studies or Russian and Soviet history, et cetera, these groups were described. And I found, first of all, that term to be extremely insular. That small group of area studies people knew what it meant, but people in other disciplines were like, what does that mean? I don't understand what titular is, what work that's supposed to be doing in this context. So it kind of limited the audience for what we were talking about. Number two, I felt like it was very passive. And so it didn't give a whole lot of agency or executive authority to, the population that it was describing. And I felt like, the more that I was, getting into the sources, whether it was letters or party documents or whatever, memoirs, et cetera, or even just talking to people in Georgia who had lived in the Soviet period, that sort of passive stance was, the opposite of what I had kind of encountered in terms of my own space. And so I developed this idea of entitled nationhood to make it a bit more active and reflect certainly what I was seeing in the case of Georgia. But I don't mean this framework to limit itself to Georgia. I would like to I hope others can maybe challenge it or see the extent to which it's helpful in looking at other non-Russian presence in the Union as well. So basically, what I'm trying to use it to describe them. First and foremost, the status of ethnic Georgians in the GSSR or Armenians in the ASSR, et cetera. And I'm using it to both embrace the statistical and legal implications of living in your own territory, as written on paper and inscribed in your Soviet passport, and therefore endowing you with special rights and privileges. These are access to education in the Georgian language in this case, preferential treatment for jobs, for party membership, all of these types of things, right? That the Soviet kind of architecture of nationality policy had developed. And this all existed in paper. Of course, in practice is a very different thing. But what I was seeing increasingly, and this is a big change from 1956, and then the divide there, is that this is not just something that existed on paper, it's something that Georgians themselves were demanding in practice, both at the kind of elite level, certainly in the Stalin era, but also then I think at a more grassroots, almost civic level in the post-Stalin period. And so, to me, that is an important development and an important kind of intervention in how we're looking at nationality in the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Empire functioned. center versus periphery. And so, you know, what it ended up producing then is a republic level hierarchy of rights that, in this case, Georgians could claim and, you know, try to push the limits of over time, ultimately increasing their power and authority and ability to kind of make decisions and shape the bounds of things within their own republic. And then sometimes trying to push that even beyond the bounds of their own republic, which I'll talk about in a minute. And of course, this had the impacts then for the non-entitled populations, right? So this kind of increased access for rights for, in this case, Georgians, you know, that means then there are kind of less opportunities then for other minorities, be they Armenians or Abkhaz. The Abkhazia case is extremely, you know, unusual and special, and I can talk about that more in Q&A if you like. Or even Russians, because they, you know, as the majority nationality in the Soviet Union, you know, they had, I think, de facto special rights and privileges throughout the polity, but in practice, you know, they didn't have it on paper in the same way that these entitled nationalities did. So that's kind of the work that I'm trying to do with this entitled nationhood concept. Quick, just ticking through some of the very diverse events and developments that I cover in the book, just to give you a flavor for that, and I can go deeper on any of these if you have particular questions on them. But I think this speaks to the type of agency and action that we're seeing through this, you know, entitled nationality paradigm. Territorial irredentist campaigns led by Georgians vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Iran in kind of the like early Cold War period, but also extending even into the 60s and 70s. Internal resettlements and deportations in the post-war period. You know, I think this is something that people really think of as happening in the 30s and in, you know, the World War II period. But there was a lot happening between 1944 and 1951 in Georgia and throughout the Caucasus. And so I look at that in detail in one chapter. Several different demonstrations and responses in Tbilisi and throughout Georgia. I mentioned 1956 already. But there's another pretty big demonstration wave in 1977 and 1978 in Tbilisi in defense of the Georgian language as enshrined in the Republic Constitution. And then also in Abkhazia, somewhat related to the Constitution, but also in this case, trying to make a stronger claim for Abkhazia to not be part of Georgia anymore. And so I look at that, and then subsequently in 1989, where you have kind of the Tbilisi Abkhazia tension that of course has extremely tragic consequences in the case of Georgia. You know, the date that really ends up being I think memorialized as, you know, the breaking point or the end of the Soviet experiment in Georgia, but also continuing to be a real moment of, you know, memory and commemoration is that of April 9th, 1989, where in pretty much the same spot as the 1956 crackdown, there you know, a demonstration against the developments in Abkhazia was also brutally repressed. And so dozens of people, again, a lot of women were killed in very, very brutal fashions and pivoted pretty quickly then to an independence movement thereafter. I look at Georgia as the capital of the Soviet second economy, which again, I think the 1956 turning point or break helped facilitate this as well. Basically, the compromise that the Georgian leadership ended up making with Moscow after the crackdown in 1956 was, you know, don't let this happen again, and we'll kind of leave you to your own devices, you know, with a couple of notable exceptions. But this meant that you had under the leadership of First Secretary Vasil Javanadze, who was running Georgia in the 50s and 60s. You know, it allowed a culture of corruption, patronage, and kind of the second economy to really flourish, kind of unmatched union-wide, which is saying something in the 60s and 70s. So that led to Javanadze's ouster in 1972, and he is replaced by Shevardnadze, who, you know, tried to rein in this sort of, you know, illicit trade and illicit economy, but ultimately wasn't able to do a very good job of it. So kind of living with the consequences of that. But that's a key element, I think, in telling this post-war Soviet Georgian story. Kind of in the Shevardnadze era in particular, looking at Georgia as an area of experimentation. You know, this was in the social sciences. This is in the realm of culture. This is in the realm of national expression. Really economy, really across the board here. And this is precisely because it was in this period when there was a much more distant kind of laissez-faire de facto agreement with Moscow that allowed some really interesting, developments to happen at the local level in Georgia. Of course, I talk about interethnic relations, and this is, certainly, I think I probably deal with Georgia's relationship with Abkhazia most frequently throughout the book, but also looking at just the broader sort of interethnic dynamics, whether it's with other key minorities or looking at specific regions where, for example, in southern Georgia, where there are pretty significant pockets of either Azerbaijani populations or Armenians, and Georgians feel themselves to be the minority there, and that of course has some important ramifications at that point, in the Soviet period, but also today still. And then finally, I look at kind of an urban history of Tbilisi, because of course, capital of Georgia, city kind of known and loved by many, including myself, but it is a city that only became, majority Georgian in terms of its population in the 1970s. And so, that is part of a broader story, I think, of post-war urbanization and development and that sort of thing that wasn't just happening in Georgia. But I kind of look at that, and in particular, the development of one neighborhood in Tbilisi, Sabartalo, which had, as Georgians living in the countryside were flocking to Tbilisi in the post-war period, some illicitly, to kind of take advantage of, new economic opportunities. You really see kind of the growth of this new Soviet Georgia happening in those neighborhoods. And so I kind of have like a urban history piece woven in to this broader nation building story. And I would be doing us a disservice if I didn't come back to Stalin at the end of this talk. So here we are. So the Stalin Factor, this is kind of, the big narrative thread of this book. And I think one that probably will generate the most discussion here, and probably what I found so far with audiences in Georgia, has also generated the most interest. So, the Stalin Factor is a curious one, right? Because his image is instrumentalized by, lots of different people in lots of different ways at various points. So, he can simultaneously be looked at as the native son of Georgia, or is he a Russianized super nationalist? And that was very much, that latter was the image that he tried to project when he was in power. I think personally, he still spoke Georgian in private. He had this sort of group from the Caucasus that he brought to Moscow with him. He still continued to like some Georgian traditions and promoting the cult of Rustaveli and things like that. But his public image was one of, someone who had risen above, his Georgianness. The extent to which that was true is maybe another matter. So you have this public versus private distinction, as well as, I think, the official cult that was constructed around him in the Stalin era. Again, one that, maybe mentioned that he was Georgian, but it was in a very centralized fashion, and that was not the sort of leading element, versus what ends up being constructed in Georgia, kind of, locally taking some of their own initiative to sort of construct a specifically Georgian cult of Stalin. And that's kind of what, comes to the fore in these events in 1956. Stalin's network. I talked about these Caucasians in the Kremlin who, on the one hand, were running this new burgeoning superpower, but on the other hand, continue to have, I think, an extraordinarily detailed interest in what was happening at home, and in some cases would kind of micromanage affairs there, either through Stalin directly or through his network. Beria being a great example of that. And so the distinction between the center and the periphery, if you want to call it that, in the Stalin era, if you're talking about Georgia, it's really hard to define because in some cases policy was even being made in the Kremlin, but the Kremlin was actually on the Black Sea coast in Abkhazia at Dacha, because that's where this group was decamped for like a good portion of the year.
Those Dutchies are still there. Russians are asking for rights.
Yeah. So yeah, the center periphery lines are very messy in the 30s and 40s, and been very contested, I would say, afterward. And then, I have from Stalin to Shevardnadze at the final bullet here. Now, I think those are the kind of two Georgians that people have heard of who aren't very close to the topic. And I think in the period that I'm covering in the book, there was a perception in the Stalin period that, yes, he's done some terrible things, but he's our guy. And if we need to appeal, we can take some sorts of pride in having a Georgian, who defeated Hitler, who is, running this first of its kind, state. And then there's a lag or an absence then between 1953, when Stalin dies and Beria is executed, and kicked out and executed, and when Shevardnadze, rises to national prominence in 1985. So, in that period, I think, there's some fascinating developments within the landscape in Georgia, but they don't kind of have that patron in the center to appeal to in the same way, and that generates some interesting things, at the local level. So again, you have this sort of Stalin narrative thread running throughout the book, and then I think something that, again, coming to today, Stalin's ghosts are still very much present in Georgian society today, but in ways that are kind of constantly changing. So officially, in 2010, they passed a law called the Liberty Charter, modeled off of laws in the Baltic states to basically criminalize showing Soviet or Nazi symbols, on public buildings and that sort of thing. So, you see the hammers and sickles and the stars and all of that stuff stripped, kind of in the 2010s. And so, that happens. It does not apply to private property. So if you want to put a bust of Stalin up in your yard, no one's going to stop you. And I think it also was unevenly applied. In Tbilisi, it was pretty thoroughly, but I think if you get out to rural regions and that sort of thing, less so. And so that's the official. There continues to be, I think, in certain sectors of the population, a real reverence for Stalin for different reasons. I think there's a generational divide to some extent, and survey data and stuff over the past 10 years has sort of shown that, okay, people who maybe grew up in the Soviet period, still continue to believe that Stalin defeated Hitler. So, and we're proud that he was a Georgian. Therefore, we're going to continue to kind of revere him for this world historical kind of event. And, that's something that, of course, is confined now to a fairly elderly population. I think there's a highly localized reverence in the town of Gori, where he was born, where there continues to be a Stalin, house museum that has not really changed much, I think, in terms of how it's operated, ever. It is, stepping into, time machine, basically, but is also a huge source of tourism revenue for the city, because everyone goes there, and really, is on the map. But yeah, you get the Stalinist version of history there, and it's interesting to see intellectually, but also bizarre to see, just given what you know about Georgia otherwise.
I remember going to that museum and being surprised by how much pride they have in the fact that Stalin came from Gori, and you really get the Stalinist perspective on the events.
Yep. And I think looking at this graffiti here, and I took this picture in 2013, so that was not long after
newly won the election.
Yeah, so this was not long after Georgian Dream, which is the party that has controlled Georgia for the past decade, since 2012, came to power. And so these matroshki that have the SSR, stamp on them, you have Stalin, Putin, and Bidzina Ivanishvili. So he was the founder of the Georgian Dream Party. He's a billionaire, very eccentric, very bizarre figure. He doesn't currently have a place in Georgian politics officially, but people regard that he is kind of the one, pulling the strings and making the calls behind the scenes. So, and I think also someone who is often accused of being, guided by Russia or a Russian stooge, etc. I think that might be a bit of an oversimplification, but you can see how then this gets plastered up all over Tbilisi in early 2013. And this sort of debate is one that I think has has continued to sort of branch out in the decades since then. I think some interesting recent studies that I've seen from sociologists have suggested that because the political environment in Georgia has gotten so polarized now, there's a kind of, I don't know, certain resentment between maybe a younger rural population and kind of, I don't know, educated urban elites in Tbilisi, young or old, who they're sort of taking the tension they might have with each other and mapping Stalin onto that somehow. So it's contrarian to maybe revere Stalin. And so a younger generation of, maybe rural men in particular are sort of embracing Stalin for reasons that are different from the maybe Soviet nostalgia crowd, who might recall a 70s sort of sense of Stalin reverence in World War II cult and that sort of thing. So, this is an evolving story. It's one that continues to inspire a lot of, opinion locally in Georgia. And, I think it's one that's not done yet, but, I'm hopeful that my book will at least contribute a little bit of nuance and explanation and background to, how that conversation came to be historically. I will leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. That was wonderful. So I'm going to ask just a couple of questions. And I think what we should do, since we're approaching the 1 hour mark, is everybody can grab lunch and then we can have a half-hour Q&A session. So I have many questions as they relate to Fletcher. I'm sure you'll get questions from students about interethnic relations in Georgia and how they apply to Abkhazia and South Ossetia when we're thinking about conflict resolution today. Also, I think it's very interesting to understand Georgia's relations with Azerbaijan and Armenia as they relate to nation building in the Soviet period. But two questions from me. The first is, we hear a lot today about decolonization of Russian studies or Soviet studies. And even Fletcher has an initiative on the decolonization of international relations. So I think this is appropriate. Your book certainly looks at Soviet history, not from a Russian perspective, but more so from a Georgian perspective. And you've created this paradigm of entitled nationhood. To what extent do you think that this can be used to explain some of the contested historical narratives in Soviet history, including today with Ukraine? I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war, in many ways, it came about because the Kremlin does not see Ukraine as a real country. So can the idea of entitled nationhood teach us something about Ukrainian nation building?
No, that's a great question, and one that I'm thinking about a lot, perhaps obviously, but I think a year ago, maybe a year and a week ago, when Putin gave his speech, basically blaming the Soviet Union for the existence of Ukraine. I mean, you probably all vaguely remember that. He gave a lot of weird speeches at that point, but there was one that for me really was just extremely memorable, in which he blamed Lenin for Ukrainian nationalism as it exists today. He blamed the Soviet Union for constructing Ukraine as a modern state, and was clearly appealing toward a Russian imperial, capital I, sensibility in understanding Ukraine, right? As little Russians, as just subservient kind of and subsumed by the Russian culture, but not really having any sort of sovereignty or territorial integrity or history, right? Deriding Ukrainian almost as a dialect, and that was not how the Soviet Union, at least officially, regarded Ukraine, and certainly not in the 1920s when they set up this broader architecture. And so, for me, that was a really telling, if terrifying moment when Putin was telling exactly how he was going to move forward here, because it isn't trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union. And I'm not trying to be a Soviet apologist here, far from it. But trying to reconstruct the Russian Empire is a quite different thing,
Right.
And so, and one that I think probably has no limits, which is also pretty alarming in a territorial sense. You're thinking about Poland or you're thinking about Finland. It was bigger than the Soviet Union was, and so so I think just as kind of a point of departure, what Putin was telling us a year ago, or slightly over a year ago, is really important. And I think I just got kicked off of my Zoom, but we're done with the presentation. So yeah, good. Presentation for you now, and so I think that this concept of entitled nationhood, and looking at, on the one hand, how the Soviet Union could function as an empire, but at the same time, how that could function differently than the Russian Empire. Yes, looking at the continuity is important and something that we should be doing, but at the end of the day, these are ideologically opposed entities, right? I mean, Lenin explicitly set the Soviet Union up to be anti-imperial. Did it end up being an anti-imperial practice? Absolutely not. But the whole point of this enterprise, as they saw things, right, as during World War I, et cetera, was, we're going to create this socialist, utopia because, capitalism and imperialism are inextricably intertwined, and that's what led us to, the tragedy of World War I. And so, again, you have a theory versus practice problem, but it's something that I think, is important for people to really understand and probe more deeply, is the extent to which those imperial continuities between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union are there, but also what was particular about the Soviet Empire, because, it did invest considerable, shocking amount of resources into constructing these national republics. And, some were, I think, had more leeway than others to do, what they wanted to do. Ukraine was, I think, an area of kind of extreme experimentation, and they were doing, a lot that looks, pretty explicitly national, at least to my mind, in the 20s and 30s. But then there clearly was a retrenchment there because, Ukraine, it was 10 times bigger, I think, than Georgia in terms of population. It had the industrial base, it had the agricultural base, once the Western lands then were taken over. And so just in terms of numerical and symbolic significance, it was just so massive in terms of, policymakers' decision and just conceptualization of the Soviet Union. So, and I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but, I think that just an understanding of Stalin and others, for them, Ukraine was an essential part of the Soviet Union. I think they regarded Georgia and other places too, but Ukraine, just because of its size and significance in all other ways, development, et cetera, and strategic location, I think it was kind of in an exceptional category for reasons other than why Georgia was a little bit exceptional, that had to do with some of the things that I talked about in my presentation. So, yeah, I think we're just at the very beginning of these discussions. There's a lot more there, but I think, yeah, it's going to generate some controversy, but also I think, ultimately some good work that needs to be done, because, the Moscow story is not the only story, and the, the polemical story is also not the only story. I think the trying to see what was possible on a local level and what nuances are really there, that's going to be the work of, subsequent generations of historians to figure out. But in practice, it's going to be hard to do if, there's active war going on or threat of war or anything like that. So
yeah, it's certainly
the other
much harder to
grim
do
reality
research in Ukraine. Well, and the term Putin used, of course, was decommunization, essentially erasing the Soviet history of Ukraine, going back to the Russian Empire. But I think there's a lot of potential to do research on our Armenian and Soviet or Kazakh and Soviet.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the other question I had, which is also relevant to Fletcher students, is related to your current work in private sector diplomacy. We have a number of students who are focusing on regional studies and political risk analysis. How has your experience as a regional studies scholar prepared you for the work that you're doing now?
Good and very appropriate questions. So I guess I'll maybe tackle the area studies as well as the historical sort of toolkit. I know that this is an interdisciplinary place. I teach at Georgetown. I went to Georgetown, so I know kind of what you all are working with. And I think, you know, the value that you get from this type of education is that you have the toolkit to then be able to translate it for other regions going forward. And that's something that I think working in the private sector has really taught me. You know, I'm absolutely working on things related to Eurasia, and you know, that's like exponentially more true, you know, since a year ago, when, you know, every client basically had some sort of need related to things emanating from the war. But I think it's also, you know, academics and students as well tend to be very narrow in how they think about their expertise and what they're able to do. So like, okay, well, I wrote a book on post-war Soviet Georgia. Like, oh, am I really comfortable talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan? You know, the academic in me is like, I don't speak Armenian, I don't speak Azerbaijani, so like, I don't know that I can really like be credible talking about that. In the private sector, they're like, hey, you know, we have 2 people covering the world. We need you to help us understand these bigger geopolitical dynamics. So being, you know, taking the toolkit that you get from a program like Fletcher or SFS or whatever, because it is interdisciplinary, and being able to apply that to learning new things on the job is something that I think is a crucial skill for the type of work that I'm doing in the private sector. And I think would be equally true if you're a foreign service officer or something, right? You know, you're bouncing around between different regions of the world, and you probably aren't going to be able to like get fluency in the language every time. And so, you know, going back to the toolkit that you've gotten here, you know, is great for the region that you're really studying, but shouldn't necessarily be limited to it in your career, because, you know, with just thinking about the challenges that we're facing now with revanchist Russia, which I think is underselling a little bit, with China, with EU regulatory, you know, policy globally, and then, you know, how the US is going to configure itself with all of those. You know, these are not confined to a region. And so even if you view yourself as like focusing on Eastern Europe or focusing on the Caucasus or something, being able to think more broadly about those bigger picture trends and dynamics, you know, that's going to, first of all, be interesting because it's the world we're living in. And second of all, I think, you know, be more relevant to the type of work that you're doing. And in my case, you know, it's what the private sector wants to hear about. And so, you know, that's something that I think the toolkit that I've gotten from, you know, an area studies and also it's kind of interdisciplinary international affairs program that I had at Georgetown, and that you are getting here too. You know, it allows you to apply that to other contexts. And then, you know, historians are able to think big, think long-term about change over time, and big questions like that, but also get extremely granular with the details. And so being able to sort of do both of those things at the same time, you know, it doesn't seem like it might be something that's very transferable to the private sector, but I've found that it actually is super helpful. So, you know, I often get questions in DC. It's like, oh, you didn't do political science, or you're not like an economist. I'm like, yeah, I'm a historian. That's actually a much more useful lens for looking at this part of the world in particular, but not only. So,
can you give us some examples of projects that you've worked on?
I mean, you know, I think before last year, you know, helping countries or companies enter the Ukrainian market or enter the Kazakh market, you know, including like looking at in periods of political change, right? So with looking at the Tokayev transition, for example, or looking at the Zelensky-Poroshenko election, what that could mean for, you know, an ad company or tech company or something who had big equities, you know, in the market. And that includes analysis, but also, you know, engagement with those governments and other stakeholders. And I mean, and since the war started, you know, everything has really changed. It's, I think it started out very much as monitoring the sanctions environment, because now, you know, we have just this like totally monumental global sanctions regime against Russia and Belarus, and one that gets more complicated by the day pretty much. And that's something that I think the private sector in particular is interested in, right? Because, you know, they want to make sure that they are continuing to be compliant with that ever-changing sanctions regime. And then, number two, trying to help C-suites basically think about what the scenarios might be for the war, but then also what the implications could be more broadly, right, on Europe, on transatlantic relations, on China, on other emerging markets, be they Latin or India or something. So I'm not doing that solo. Like I have colleagues who are experts in those other regions who are helping to do that. But over the past year, it's been a lot of that, which is of course dependent on events on the ground. But because that has an impact on companies who maybe had an on the ground presence in either market, of course. Many have left Russia as well since then. But anybody who touches Europe or touches China or touches Central Asia, they're affected by it too in secondary and tertiary fashions. And so that's what it's vague, but that's been what I've been doing for the past year.
Great.
Okay, so let's take a short break, grab some food, and then we can have some more time for questions.
I probably should ask this before. Are you like posting this after the fact or?
I'm not planning to. Did you?
I didn't say anything that would be inappropriate. I should have asked. But
Yeah. Would you have a student usually do like a write-up or a blog post? And we'll be happy to share it with you before.
yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah. I tend to err on the side of like being candid and would prefer to do that. I think it's more interesting.
Of course, yes.
So I did it for this. This started out as my doctoral dissertation, and so I did the full between 2012
Like something for lunch.
Yes. If I need to write a second. They got an app. Hi, thank you for coming. You too.
I was looking at it for a space 5 minutes because I couldn't expect to see that.
Mythology is. Yeah. So his name is Nick. Yeah, he goes by Nico. Yeah. Yeah.
Here in Georgia, there are 2 governments.
Yep.
At the end of.
Yeah, I got to see the end of stuff. Well, I was there, 2011. So that's what I saw.
Made some good friends. I saw
The end of stuff actually, I got to see the beginning of the.
So, it's only expected some good friends.
Yeah.
I know.
I figured. I mean, it's a small place. But yeah. The people who are interested in this stuff.
Sorry, Tom.
You want me?
No, I was going to ask Claire later to sign for.
Sorry, how long have you been in Georgia for? In total?
4 years.
So I was there from 2011 to 2013, and then like for a little bit in 2015, and yeah, like for but like the research. I still do a lot of work on in my private sector. Like the most. I love living. Yeah, but I follow the line. Okay, I already said that. Like, yeah, that's free, but it's also kind of like, obviously. I mean, the people for somebody working on the topics that I was studying, like people that I knew in similar states, who were doing research elsewhere, like, very different. And I found just like people to people interactions, type of industry or whatever, just talking about the project. Like, it was an extremely supportive environment, and
Are there many Georgian scholars who are doing this kind of research?
there's some now starting. It's happening interestingly kind of like the civil society with the university. So there's some like Julia State University, which is I think one of the leading based universities now. Like they have a program in Georgian studies, and they're starting to do more like things. But in general, like people are more inclined to focus on the independence period. Shaktivadze and that crowd, or
Let's stop in about 15 minutes, but I'd like to give a little bit.
it makes sense, right? Like here as a Georgian triumph rather than yeah, it makes sense. But I'm not even feeling the abstract.
Excited Stephen Jones quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm doing talk tomorrow.
Actually, yeah, posted on.
Yeah. So I'm taking history tomorrow, seeing if they're tonight, and actually he and Technical today are putting, they're putting like an edited volume together on Soviet world history, and so I wrote the chapter on the so that's like a great initiative to mostly Georgian scholars. I think that's like me, Eric Scott too. Excited about that.
All right, so let's go ahead and have some more questions. So you all can raise your hands and ask a question.
Thank you, Professor, for this. It's really talk to me. Soviet history of South Caucasus, I agree with Thailand. Understand the Pacific. Someone studying Armenian, but I don't going to talk about. This is my research in the Armenian archive. From the Soviet history of Nagorno-Karabakh, and you start to realize that everything in terms of current academic discourse about the post-Soviet conflict in South starts in 1990. And the 70 years is neglected. It has a lot to say about what's happening now. So
Absolutely.
in what way, I mean, so many Armenians and Georgians especially reference sort of Stalin being the commissar of nationalities in the 20s as the start of the turmoil that the Caucasus has experienced up until this point. But what extent do you think that the conflicts today, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Nagorno-Karabakh, and Karabakh is a little bit different, but somewhat the same in terms of legacy. But what extent do you see this as being, what's the fine line between you have the Russian occupation in Georgia, and then you have the Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh, but you also have an issue, misnomer, but and then you also have the self-determination issue of history.
Yeah.
So how you see the interplay between these and political discourse?
No, extremely good question. And I think something that I try to do in my book is not try to explain the war in Abkhazia or the current occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia starting at 1991. I think that people certainly kind of in the policy space pretend like there was not a prehistory there. Or if they think that there's a prehistory, they devolve to some sort of ancient ethnic hatred, thing, which obviously is super unproductive. I love a quote from Ron Sunni, and he's talking about Karabakh. I think that this is a conflict that descends from the mists of the 20th century or something like that, which I think really says a lot, but he's also gotten a lot of flack for. And I think, absolutely looking at how the borders were drawn and how the different autonomies were granted in the 20s matters, because there was a lot at play in that moment, and certainly divisions between Stalin and Orjonikidze on the one hand and Lenin on the other for how power should be distributed within the Caucasus and who the real sort of chauvinist threats were at the local level. And Lenin died before he could really carry his vision out. But I think looking at the extent to which these issues were moments where groups could mobilize in the Soviet period, that's critical. And that's something that in my book, I do. I look at, on Abkhazia, you have mass mobilization and or really wide scale petition movements starting in 1947, and it happens every 10 years, kind of increasing in terms of intensity as well as the demands that are made each time. And those were, directed at Moscow, and Moscow would just pick into Tbilisi and say, handle it. And needless to say, their handling of it did not dissuade Abkhaz, mobilization subsequently. So I think looking at what actually was happening at the local level in terms of grievances, in terms of mobilization, that sort of thing, is really important. What the consequences or responses were of that. 1965, I know, for the genocide anniversary and from this moment of demonstration in Yerevan, I believe that was also when the kind of specific claim on Karabakh really started to gain momentum as well, as I understand from Michael Lehman's book, which I don't know if you've read because it's in German, but she has some English language articles about that too. And I feel like that's, a pretty important detail, but that often gets sort of just overlooked when looking at the Karabakh conflict. It kind of starts with the war and then, continues, of course, to today. But that moment in 1965 strikes me as being a pretty important moment, a surprising one in terms of the demands and claims that were being made by Armenians. The lack of violent response from the Soviet army compared to what's happening in Georgia, for example. And then what that sort of gave in terms of legitimacy for the mobilization movement that would happen subsequently. So I think we have to kind of take those moments in Soviet history seriously, even if maybe they didn't generate results in real time. But great to hear that you're working on that and able to do some good work in Armenian archives. It is. It's a lot, but I've heard pretty good things about doing research there.
That's the bureaucracy.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's inevitable, and that was one good thing about doing research in Georgia was, it was maybe not so organized, but you could cut through a lot of the bureaucracy, making for an efficient archival experience, which is kind of an oxymoron, I think, in most cases, certainly in the US.
We have an entire separate seminar on how to do archival work in the post-Soviet space. But quite challenging. Yes.
Hi, so I'm Sarah. I do kind of some nation building work. So a lot of my interest in a lot of discussion that kind of comes up is how do you, when you're coming at it from the perspective of the post-Soviet states that are not Russia, how do you separate the achievements and sort of the national building projects and a lot of their separate, the things that happened from the national perspective versus the overall Soviet perspective? So I see a lot more dialogue between the two, and I guess in the Georgian case, I was wondering.
And Belarus is an interesting counterexample, I think, in a lot of ways. But it's something that I think I see a lot of contradiction in the Georgian case. You have, on the one hand, and this is actually the opening vignette of my book, I sort of walk through it's called the Metatsunda Pantheon. And so it's their place where they bury their great men, basically. But it's a 19th century and 20th century project for the most part. So you have the father of the Georgian nation and great poets and that sort of thing buried there. But you also have the reason why it was opened was to commemorate the death of Alexander Krivoyedov and celebrate Russian-Georgian friendship. So that's different from maybe the version that you might get if you hear about it from a tour guide today. I don't know. And so you have a mix of Soviet cultural icons who were Georgian, the kind of 19th century national intelligentsia, people like Ilya Chapchapadze, and then Ziad Gamsakhurdia, the first president of independent Georgia, and Saakashvili reinterred him there from Chechnya early in his presidency. So there's a lot of interesting politics happening in this state. So that's how I open my book, basically, because that is an interesting contrast to the official sort of writing of Soviet history in Georgia, kind of from a political perspective. And this was clearly a Saakashvili project to deride the Soviet period as one of just, complete and uncomplicated occupation as part of a broader narrative of consistent Russian occupation of Georgia, starting from 1783 to today, looking at Abkhazia. Yeah. And, that's a story. That's the museum that they have, similar again, kind of to what, the museum you might see in Lithuania or Latvia. If you model this museum after on East Valley Avenue, the Museum of Soviet Occupation. But, it's skipping over some pretty important details, I think. And it's also, looking at a very, it's not looking at, I think, Georgians within the Soviet Union, certainly. And it's avoiding the Stalin era and Georgian, certain Georgians' role in that, though not to sort of make all Georgians complicit with that. Of course, that was not the case. And just to make sure it is said, in the Stalin era, Georgians in no way got a pass from the, violence and repression and terror because Stalin and his group was running the show. Anything, it's quite the opposite. So I think, you have contradictory sort of constructions now of the extent to which the Soviet period of Georgian history, is or is not part of this grander narrative. And so, it's a lot more kind of, it's a lot more of a hodgepodge in the Pantheon version, and it's a very neat and tidy version in the official museum. And the reality is probably, somewhere in between, being able to put cultural, Soviet cultural icons next to, the father of the Georgian nation, next to Alexander Griboyedov and his Georgian noble wife, next to Stalin's mother, who's also buried there still. So, I think that kind of messier, inconsistent version is probably closer to the reality. But yeah, I suspect that, Belarus is a really interesting counterexample of that. So hopefully you end up publishing. Yeah, there's been so little studied on Belarus for obvious reasons in terms of archival access and whatnot, but it's a really good case study.
Yeah, that's why we opened the Uber Pantheon to rectify that.
Yeah.
Eclecticism.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
It is quite too many times. Yeah. So I have a question about I have 1,000 questions, but I'll also ask them one. Good work.
Thank you.
It's tough to conduct research about Georgia, but also find the resources and learn Georgian, which I really appreciate. You have Ramas Kurdaz that know him, and he must be a good teacher. He's not only a teacher.
He was my first teacher.
He's a scientist in the Georgian language, so he would teach us some good things.
Absolutely.
So
I didn't know that I needed to know all of, the linguistic aspect of things, but
so it's great. I'm not only Georgian, but I was born in Abkhazia.
Oh, okay.
Ethnically Abkhazia. I define myself as ethnically Abkhazian, nationally Georgian. And this is my life, a big part of it. I have a question about the nation building thing. You used the nation building, and at the same time you added a stipulation that it's not meant to be somehow figurative or something like that. And I don't take it as such. I wonder how people would take this notion of nation building. How do you actually define it? Some would ask you briefly define nation building, what it looks like in Georgia as part of the USSR. Starting with the fact that nation building was launched with occupation and subsequent, even though we didn't see a lot of more sort of repressions in Georgia, you see a massive attacks, killing of Georgia's intellectual elite.
Yes, I mean 1924.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And essentially, and creation, let's say, artificial creation of the two conflicts at least.
Yep.
I'm part of one, and then subsequent repressions in the country, so on and so forth. So having that in the history, what is the nation building look like actually, and what as part of that, how do you actually define the entitlement point?
Sure.
Because the Georgian history, this is not the first time I hear it. It's at least 900 times. The Georgians were somehow entitled and they had fun, a good time in the Soviet time. Did you look at part of history where that entitlement of some sort may have been or was a chosen policy of the Soviet central apparatus?
So
To
short answer,
tranquilize
yeah. So I think in terms of nation building, you make a very excellent point that I do talk about in the book that, in the case of Georgia, this sort of Soviet nation building policies and apparatus, which was something that was very, deliberate, driven from the center, et cetera. They were not starting from scratch, far from it. You had this extremely, developed sense of what it meant to be, meant to be Georgian, starting kind of in a modern sense, right, from the mid 19th century. You have these three generations of intellectuals, including Leo Chokchavadze, Nikoladze, Georgi Tsariteli, that whole group and their literary counterparts, who were, figuring out how to define what it meant to be Georgian in a Russian imperial context and writing in Georgian, promoting Georgian print culture, et cetera. So that was clearly a very rich tradition there that I think, and one that, of course, helped then for Nouri Jordania and his government to really solidify in the brief, period that they had independence. And so, starting the first university, et cetera. And so, I think the Georgia that the Soviets invaded, or the Bolsheviks invaded, it wasn't the Soviet Union at that point. It was a formidable challenge precisely because there was that history of national consciousness, not only in the recent past, but also this history of earlier statehood, right? Whether it's David the Builder, whether it's Hamadate, et cetera, that Georgians, were very conscious of and could appeal to, right? As being, not just Georgian in a modern sense, but having this deeper history and legitimacy with regard to language and church and that sort of thing. And so, I think Lenin and certainly Stalin and others were very aware of that and understood why Georgia would be such a challenge to fully subdue for that reason. There was that level of development that was popular, right? I mean, that's why the Jordania government had the level of support that it did, was because it was legitimately democratically elected and had popular support. Exactly. Exactly. So, progressive, not just, I think, for the region, but like for the world. And so, was this real very, very small sliver of reform and experimentation that more people should be aware of, for sure. But that's precisely why it was such a challenge for the Bolsheviks, was because you didn't have a local power base. You had a clearly defined sort of conception of what it meant to be Georgian. And that needed to be, reshaped towards Soviet ends, basically. And so one of the ways to do that is through extreme violence, right? I mean, you mentioned, yes, Georgia didn't have a Holodomor level persecution from Moscow, but the crackdown in 1924 was significant when there was an attempted sort of uprising that was violently crushed and helped to propel Lavrentiy Beria to power. He certainly took advantage of that situation, very effectively. And so that, effectively decapitated the religious, cultural, intellectual elite of Georgia, such that then a new generation of Bolshevik, elites could be formed. Exactly. So those who were not kind of killed or arrested as part of that uprising then, had to be sort of co-opted by the state in some cases, right? So the cultural elite of the 30s looks very different from the cultural elite of the 20s or, the 19th century period. And so I think, from the Soviet Georgian nation building project then that sort of went forward over the next 65 years, it was a bit of figuring out what from that recent as well as distant past kind of belonged in the sort of Soviet Georgian canon, what needed to be adapted to reflect the new realities, and then, how to pass that down to subsequent generations, if that makes sense. So, the toolkit was something that was ubiquitous throughout the Soviet Union, but the Georgian case was a little bit different for the reasons that I just mentioned, and also meant that in the 1920s, for example, Lenin argued that Georgia needed to have more concessions because of all of those reasons in order to, maintain Soviet power in the region. They would need to be able to have more, room for more kind of national distinctions and outlets for local power and that sort of stuff. Stalin did not necessarily agree with that, but there is, a kind of key debate from 1922 about the extent to which the Soviet Union would be federal or centralized. And it was like a pretty vicious debate, actually, between Stalin and Orджonikidze on the one hand and Lenin on the other. But involves some very hyper-local episodes in Tbilisi where Orджonikidze slaps somebody and that becomes a whole thing. But anyway, what it means is that the map that resulted from what's called the Georgian affair that Jeremy Smith writes about in some detail in his book, that ends up defining the map and the ethno-territorial structure of the entire Soviet Union, but is something that is kind of derived from this local political debate in Georgia. And so I think that kind of speaks to some of this tension as well. The extent to which something is local versus all union, and then what that looks like in practice in the case of Georgia.
Do you think, and I will not exploit my Georgianness here, I partially did, the entitlement part, as a historian to you, I have my established feelings about that. But was it purposeful entitlement? Also, would be, I would say, segment of history where you could cause some sort of entitlement, Stalin and Beria episode of history, but the rest of it, do you think the entitlement was a chosen policy?
So I think, and I'm using the entitlement terminology as a kind of direct alternative to using titular, just because I don't really like the term titular to describe, any of these populations, because I just don't think it analytically does a whole lot. And so entitlement and entitled was my attempt to sort of correct that. I kind of got there, honestly, from looking a little bit deeper into both Georgian and Russian and Polish history, honestly, the titled nobility, the entrenched, importance of nobility and hierarchies in both, Georgian 18th and 19th century history, and the extent to which that was then incorporated into the Russian, imperial structure. And the same thing with the Polish Factor. And so there was this notion of a titled nobility. And then, of course, the objective is quite different in the Soviet case, but that sort of just culture and history and legacy, I think that there's something there. And so that's kind of how I got to entitlement as a term, in addition to it being a bit more active. And you are asking about the extent to which Georgians had, a privileged position, I guess, in Stalin era, right? That's sometimes how people phrase the question, right? And I think there was a perception by Georgians and non-Georgians that the Georgians were in a privileged position when Georgians were running the show in Moscow. That does not mean that, repression in Georgia was any less, though I think that non-Georgians perceive that maybe was the case, but that is not accurate. I think, what I've seen in the Stalin era in particular is that it means that Georgians, both kind of, ordinary people as well as elites, would often appeal to Stalin's or Beria's or whoever's Georgianness if they're trying to get something that they want. So, appealing to trying to pull their national heartstrings, basically, if they're writing them a letter because they, want to save the poor Georgian language school in Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani, officials are trying to close. They're really appealing to the national sentiments of these guys in Moscow, which I talk about in one of the chapters of this book. Things like that, where they're playing up the Georgian link in hopes that it will get them something. I don't think they're the only ones doing this. Armenians did the same thing with Mikoyan, et cetera. And so, but there was a perception that if you appeal to their Georgianness, you have a better chance of succeeding kind of through that special link. Again, probably a mixed record of success there, but there was that perception. They don't have that ability in the post-Stalin, post-Beria era. And so that's where I think you see more appeals to things that are like the abstract values of, what Marxism, Leninism, nationality policy means, or what's enshrined in the Soviet constitution. And so saying like, hey, on paper, our constitution says that the Georgian language is the official language of the Georgian SSR. We don't want that removed in 1978. And so we're going to take to the streets and also have this massive petition campaign to basically, get Shevardnadze to do an about face and say that we're not going to change the constitution according with Moscow's wishes. And so, that's a very different way to engage with like grievance and claims and stuff vis-a-vis the state than the like highly personalized, often ethicized notion of privilege and stuff in the Stalin era. So that's kind of how I see it. But there is a perception versus practice distinction too.
Please, we'll chat next time more.
That is all the time we have for this event, but we have the room for another 20 minutes, so you're welcome to stay and finish lunch. Of course, we'll give Claire the opportunity to have her lunch. But congratulations again on the book, and please join me in a round of applause.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate the interest and the questions, and please be in touch if I can ever be helpful to any of you. So
Thanks, everyone.
Can I have my?
Oh, thanks, Cal. I signed, would you mind?